I was asked just to talk a little bit about WHOIS in GDPR for beginners. So that's not everybody on the call. Some people have been pretty immersed in this, and this will seem pretty elementary. And this was just an effort to provide some elementary information um, to um, to folks to sort of get up to speed about what we're talking about with the issues that are now kind of dominating a lot of the listserv and emails and meetings, etc. So I'll just quickly go through this and I'll take some questions, but I'm happy to take some questions via email as well if something is unclear and we run out of time. So basically, the GDPR is the European Union's data protection regulations that replaced the privacy directive. So just as a technical matter, it went from something that was kind of voluntary for member states. There's somebody that should mute their line because they've got a lot of paper rustling or something going on. The regulations will replace a directive which sort of made it voluntary for something that makes it mandatory as a regulation. And it has a pretty big penalty of 20 million euros or 4% of annual global revenue, whichever is greater. And it's been around for quite a while, but the date at which they're going to start enforcing it is on May 25th, which is coming up in about 10 days, as Alan mentioned. So, I mean, basically, there's an intersection between this new regulation and this kind of all-access WHOIS database that we've had up for the entire life of the internet, and we've had discussions about how to better manage it for nearly that same amount of time. But these are some of the specific areas of the GDPR that affect WHOIS. One is that it requires that personal data be collected for a specific explicit purposes. In other words, you can't just collect data, any data that you want. You have to have a particular reason that's tied to your mission for collecting that data. And then you also have to articulate how you obtain consent from the subject. There's requirements for performance of this contract, legal obligations for people that are going to end up holding on to the data. So that ends up being like the registrars and registries, whether it's a thin WHOIS or a thick WHOIS, that are going to be sort of holding on to this data. And it requires a legitimate interest for processing the data for these types of entities. And there's a requirement to have security measures in place, and there's some notion of how this data can cross national boundaries. So technically, this is just meant to refer to European citizens, but one of the discussions that is being hotly debated right now is whether or not folks, registries and registrars, could just adopt these rules across the board, even though there might be different regulations in nearly every jurisdiction. So this is one of the things that's being discussed as well. But you can see that it requires a little bit more discipline in thinking about the data than we've exercised with the WHOIS database to date. So there is this interim model that has been proposed by ICANN, because ICANN itself is considered to be a controller and processor of data, and so they've started to, and they have contracts with all of these registries and registrars that require the collection of this data. And so given that those contracts are in place, ICANN itself has been motivated to put some kind of interim compliance model in place before the 25th that's gone through a number of different revs, but basically entails collecting the same data that we've been collecting, and then trying to come up with a tiered access system for getting at that data. But it's not, it wasn't, it hasn't gotten a lot of love from the Europeans just yet. And so there is a request by ICANN to try and get the Europeans to kind of slow down their enforcement in this case, given that we're sort of showing our work, if you will, in attempting to become in compliance with the regulation. So there's this interim model that basically has tiered or layered access to WHOIS data. They would collect all the data for thick WHOIS. The registrar would be required to transfer to the registry full data sets. The registries and registrars would be required to continue to transfer the full data set collected from the registrant or transfer to the registries to the data escrow agent. Registries and registrars would be required to apply the model to collection and processing linked to the European Economic Area. Registrars must provide registrants with the opportunity to opt into publication of full contact details in the public WHOIS, so that maybe if you're a company, you actually want more data out there than you would if you're an individual. And to access registration data not published in the public WHOIS, registries and registrars would provide access to non-public registration data only for a defined set of third-party requesters certified under a formal accreditation program. So this is the interim model that's being proposed by ICANN at this point. So there was a response from the European Working Party 29 in the letter, and they found some aspects of this interim model to be inadequate. The first is that it didn't specify sufficiently and comprehensively a legitimate purpose to collect data. And so this is one of the most active debates that's going on in this space, because it's the difference between uses that we've come upon over time. In other words, over time we've started using WHOIS data for a number of different things that were not foreseen when the WHOIS database was constructed in the first place. And so there are some that argue that our uses go beyond the purpose of the collection of that data. And then there are some, including our fearless leader here, Alan, that I believe that there's been an evolution to the purpose of the collection of the data, because we look at the security and stability of the DNS overall, and that includes some measure of consumer protection. And so it might just be a question of the interim model being more specific in outlining the purpose of collecting different types of data, rather than just saying we'll keep collecting what it is we've been collecting. So they said the interim model didn't specify sufficiently the legal grounds for collecting data or to provide access to non-public WHOIS data. Didn't have the appropriate security in place to satisfy it, and does not ensure transfers of personal data to third countries or organizations are in compliance. So there was some pushback on the interim model, and some negotiations that are taking place now between ICANN org and some European data protection agencies to see if they can get more clarity and a little bit more time. The next thing that I was asked to talk about, and the effort that's been going on in parallel, is an actual accreditation model for accessing the data. So on the one hand, we need to justify why the data is being collected and stored, and how it's being stored, how it's being protected, etc. But the other is that we have to have a mechanism by which we authorize people to gain access to that data. And the most sort of actively worked on version of an accreditation and access model was created by the IPC and the BC, and designed for long-term compliance with GDPR. So basically, we're now at version 1.5 of this, and basically, you have to have different types of entities that are pre-authorized to use the non-public WHOIS data, and types of activities for which that data will be used, and durations for which that data will be used and maintained by the requesters. And so those types of entities might include researchers, cybersecurity researchers, folks that are working to try and stop other types of spam and DNS abuse. It might include IP owners that are trying to prevent counterfeit versions of things from being on the web. And so there's a number of different types of consumer protection organizations that might request the data and try to use it in different ways. And so this new access model that we can make available to everyone. In fact, maybe someone on staff can provide a link here in the chat, is being sort of hotly considered. And so it's about, again, trying to figure out how granular we need to parse down the types of entities that could gain access to the data, and also what their use and the duration of that use of that data is going to be. So what does this mean for our constituency, the end user? Well, the first is, if we don't get this all figured out, then the answer, the sort of draconian answer, is going to be to simply have the WHOIS database go dark. And so that could be pretty frightening from a consumer protection standpoint, if there simply isn't any public WHOIS data, and we don't have the ability to track people down when there's errors, track people down when there's some sort of consumer fraud or abuse going on, et cetera. And that's why there's a scramble to try and get some of this figured out now. Each model has concerns associated with access to information to protect consumers. It'd be tough to prevent cyber attacks and other crimes, and ultimately it'll make it difficult to access registrants' information in the European Union. So that's why the stakes are kind of high to get this figured out as quickly as possible, especially if the European Union doesn't grant some kind of enforcement moratorium to get our feet back under us. Unfortunately, this has been coming for a long time, and we dallied in paying attention to it. We did have a little transition going on, and a accountability framework to design, and things like that that were quite distracting. But this is here and this is now, and if we don't get on top of it, WHOIS could go dark, and that's really what the stakes are for end user and for consumer protection of end users. Next slide, that may be it. Yeah. So are there questions that I can answer here in the no time that I have left? What are the chances that there will be some agreement before the deadline, and what are the repercussions? Again, I don't know what the chances are. There are a number of things that are happening in parallel. There's some direct negotiation between ICANN.org and some data protection agencies in Europe. There's also a potential of actually going to European court to ask for some kind of a stay. And as far as actually handicapping this, I don't know the answer. As a practical matter, the European Union isn't that quick to enforce such regulations, and so we probably don't need to worry about enforcement as a practical matter. But I think everyone's lawyer, every registry and every registrar is telling the organization they need to do something to protect themselves, and that's what's going to cause a kind of WHOIS blackout in the near term if we don't reach something. Alan, you apparently have your hand up. I just don't see it. So go ahead.
Thank you very much. Two comments. First of all, on how quickly will be enforced. The data commissioners can decide to be somewhat lenient in their enforcement and be gentle, but they really don't have a choice but to enforce, because they are subject to actual financial penalties if someone makes a claim that their privacy is not being honored and the data commissioner ignores it. And they're under rather tight timelines to do this. So although they have flexibility in how they enforce, their enforcement really cannot be deferred. So the courts may be the only way that a deferral, a blanket deferral, can be obtained. One of the comments I was going to make is on the issue of the rationale for collecting the data. The data commissioners have said basically we should mind our own business, only look at the reasons why we need the data, that is to maintain the domain name system, and not what other people need it for, such as law enforcement. The problem there is that our bylaws basically say we must ensure a reliable and trustworthy DNS, which means law enforcement must be able to take action. If we don't ensure that the data is collected, no matter how good the rationale that law enforcement has for getting the data, if it's not collected, it can't be given to them. And in fact, GDPR regulations allow for us to collect data that we don't need, but other interested parties do. It all comes down to the definition of public interest. and whether we can determine public interest or only governments can determine public interest. So it's a really interesting situation. Thank you.